January 22nd, 1945. East Prussia. The wind moved like a knife across the fields, the kind that didn't cut skin so much as intention. We marched past wagons of civilians and cows with icicles in their whiskers, past houses whose windows stared at us like empty eyes. The map said this was still Germany. The sky said it belonged to winter. Somewhere behind the white line of trees, the Red Army kept pushing west. Somewhere ahead, there was supposed to be a road. Between the two, there was us, and the men who wore our uniform but scared us more than any shell. My name was Matthias Richter. I was 20 and had learned two things that month: how to keep my feet from freezing and how not to look Lieutenant Becker in the eyes. He was the kind of officer winter makes, crisp, controlled, a voice made of orders. He carried a Walter at his hip like it was part of his bones. He believed in discipline the way other men believe in God, and in that belief there was no room for mercy. We had a word for the ones who enforced it: Feldgendarmerie, chain dogs, Kettenhunde. They wore metal gorgets at their throats and could make a man disappear with a sentence shouted into the snow. We were told to hold a village with 2 streets and a church missing its steeple. The men built outposts with doors pulled from empty houses. The sergeant counted ammunition and found that numbers shrank faster in winter. Becker paced the lane with his collar up, telling us we would stop the Russians here because we had to, as if logic could be a weapon. He spoke of duty and of the fatherland in words that felt heavy in the air and hollow in the stomach. We nodded because nodding is a kind of heat. That night, the artillery began. Not a storm, just a careful tapping on the shoulder to remind us we were seen. We crouched in the cattle stalls we called positions, listened to the shells roll over, and tried not to think of the people we'd passed on the road. Women with blankets for faces, and boys pushing prams that carried everything a family was. The fear that kept my heart thin was not of the sound above, it was of the steps behind. Stay with me. This is where the real enemy walks in wearing our boots. At dawn, Becker ordered a probing attack east of the village, across a field the color of old bone. We ran in twos toward a copse of trees that made a thin black comb against the horizon. The ground was glass under powder. About 50 meters out, the first machine gun whisper stitched the snow. We hit the ground and pretended to be stones. Hans Keller, a man from my home district who used to deliver flour in a mule cart, lay 2 bodies over. He raised a hand, not to surrender, not to signal, just to ask the morning a question. "Sir," he called back, voice small in the white, "we can't make it. The fire's too—" "Advance," Becker said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Hans didn't move. He looked at me, not for courage, but for confirmation that his fear was real. I nodded without meaning to. The gun whispered again. Snow jumped like startled fish. "Stand up, Private Keller," Becker said as he walked toward us, calm as a man going to fetch wood. Hans shook his head once. "Sir, if we—" Becker drew the Walter and pointed it at the space above Hans's left eye. He spoke for us all. "Advance or face a court-martial here." There were courts of a kind. You could set one up in a lane between 2 barns and give a man a trial measured in breaths. Everyone had heard stories. Some of them wore our faces. Thousands had been shot for words like cowardice and defeatism, for stepping back when the doctrine demanded forward. We called the places where it happened Standrecht, like that made it law. The Red Army was still a ridge away. The sentence was right here. Hans stood because that's what fear does. It lifts you. He took 3 steps and the gun in the trees found him in the 4th. He fell neatly, as if he'd meant to lie down. Becker didn't look at him. He looked at us. The message was as clean as the cold. We did not advance. The lieutenant called it a tactical pause. The rest of us called it not dying yet. When the fire slackened, we crawled backward to the hedges and pretended we'd learned something other than the lesson we had. By afternoon, the Feldgendarmerie arrived, chain gorgets catching a pale sun. They spoke to Becker a few paces away. We couldn't hear the words, but we knew the conversation. It smelled like metal and certainty. When it ended, two of the chain dogs walked the lane and asked if anyone had seen cowardly behavior. Men stared at the ground the way farmers do before rain. The chain dogs moved on. Becker wiped his pistol as if it had been out in weather. That night, Frost drew lace on the windows of the schoolhouse we used as a command post. The blackboard still had a sum written on it, addition that would never balance now. I lay on the floor beside the stove and listened to boots and whispers. Someone shared a crust of bread with the kind of generosity hunger invents. Someone else said the Russians were merciful compared to our own. He did not say it twice. In the morning, the Fell Gendarmerie stopped a column of stragglers on the Western Road. Cooks, clerks, men who had lost their companies in the night and hoped to find a safer line to stand in. A chain dog with the voice of a tax collector asked for papers. Papers were a passport to breath. Losing them felt like losing your name. One boy had an order stamped 2 days prior that said, "Temporary reassignment." The stamp was crooked. The chain dog cocked his head, then his pistol. The boy's legs went soft. Becker didn't look away. We set up a blocking position south of the village, a little hedge and a prayer. A woman with a red scarf walked by, leading 2 children with faces too clean for the day. She didn't ask for help. She didn't meet our eyes. War had taught us all the same trick. By evening, the ammunition was a list we could recite. Becker divided it the way accountants divide debt. When he held out a few rounds to me, our gloves touched. His hand was steady. Mine wasn't. He noticed. For a second, his eyes softened, not with pity, but with an appraiser's interest. "Fear is useful," he said. "It keeps a line from breaking." He could have been talking about wire. If this story is already tightening your chest, keep reading, because obedience has a second edge you don't see coming. On the 3rd day, the quartermaster didn't come. The kitchen didn't fire. The men's words got shorter. Becker ordered a patrol to requisition food from the next hamlet over. Requisition was a polite verb for kicking doors. I was on the patrol. We found a barn with crates of potatoes buried under straw. While we worked, a corporal pocketed a strip of cured meat from a hook, looked over his shoulder and slid it inside his coat. Becker stepped into the doorway as if the barn had summoned him. "Put it back," he said. The corporal hesitated. He was 30, which made him ancient to us. He had a picture of a boy in his wallet and a scar that suggested he'd already given the Reich more than it had paid for. "Sir, it's for the squad." Becker's jaw twitched once, a tiny movement like a man resisting the urge to yawn during a hymn. "The squad eats together when I say, 'Put it back.'" The corporal obeyed. Becker nodded, then turned to me. "Shoot him," he said. The barn made a sound like a throat closing. My rifle felt like someone else's. The corporal looked from Becker to me, and in that moment he didn't ask for mercy. He asked for the rules to make sense. Becker's voice grew softer. "Discipline is a wall. One brick loose and the house falls on all of us." I didn't fire, not because I was brave, but because my hands had forgotten how. Becker's mouth became a small line. "Then I will," he said, and he did. No gore, no drama, just the crisp punctuation of a decision. We carried the potatoes back through the snow without speaking. That night, a rumor walked the line that the Russians had taken the bridge at the river. Men breathed shallower. Becker walked from post to post, back straight against a wind that loved no one. At dawn, the Red Army tested us with mortars and then with men. We fired until heat left the barrels. They were too many. We were too few. Becker kept us on the line by force of will and the memory of the Walter. Retreat would have been sensible. Sense was not in the order book. When the 3rd push came, the left flank folded like wet cardboard. A boy beside me started to cry the way a kettle boils. First a soft rise, then a sound that had weight. Becker appeared, grabbed him by the collar, and shook him back into the present. "Stand," he commanded. The boy stood. I did too. Most of us did. That is the terrible power of a man you fear more than bullets. He can make you stay. By noon, the village was smoke and splinters. Becker finally gave the word he hated: fall back. We moved through gardens where summer had once grown and into the orchard, where trees without leaves held up a pale sky. At the edge of the wood, a group of us stumbled over roots and exhaustion. Becker's back was to us, pistol in hand, firing measured shots to slow shapes we couldn't see. He turned to order us up and saw what we were. Done. He raised the Walther, not at the Russians, at us. It is a strange thing to realize you are more enemy to your officer than the men in the tree line are. Something old and stubborn in me broke then, not like glass, but like a rope that had been fraying since January. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was the sergeant, maybe it was me, maybe it was the idea that we were done being pointed at like dogs. The shot that ended Becker's orders was quieter than I expected. He fell the way proud men do, surprised. No one spoke his name. No one cheered. The silence wasn't relief. It was the sound of a spell lifting and leaving us with what we had done and what still needed doing. We dropped our rifles in a ditch and walked with our hands up toward the road where the Red Army would find us. Surrender felt like stepping off a roof and hoping for a river. When the Soviet patrol appeared, they were mud and cold and human. They shouted and gestured and took our watches with the bored efficiency of men who've learned that mercy runs on rations. I was afraid, but it was a clean fear, the kind that points forward. The other kind had been a circle. If you're still with me, understand this. I feared the enemy, I feared death, I feared the cold. But the fear that shaped me was of my own side, of officers who had been taught that obedience was air and that the only cure for hesitation was a bullet in the back. Our army shot thousands of its own in those last years, not for treason in any meaningful sense, but for flinching when steel met bone. The Allies terrified us less because they were over the hill. Our officers terrified us because they stood at our shoulder. Years later, when a different Germany paid me to study mathematics at a quiet university, I counted things for a living. I learned proofs that made sense and taught boys who wore no uniforms how to make numbers behave. Sometimes, when a student froze at the board, I would think of Becker and step between the boy and the silence with a gentler sentence. Take your time. Mercy applied to numbers is not a virtue, but it was a practice I wanted to keep. If this story has moved something in you, remember what it cost to build an army out of fear. Fear can hold a line for a day. It cannot build a country worth surviving. And tell me, honestly, in that orchard, with the sky low and the order to stand ringing in your ears, would you have obeyed until it killed you or stepped out of the circle before it closed?